Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's WREN webinar. With that, I'd like to formally start today's call and turn it over to Andrea Copping, Senior Scientist. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'd like to welcome you to this 8th webinar in our WREN series. WREN is an international agreement standing for resolving challenges between wind energy and wildlife. And this is an international program, and although today's webinar really focuses on one area off the U.S. coast, it has very strong international basis and implications. We are going to see today a wonderful meld of capabilities originally developed in Europe coming together with capabilities in the U.S. to undertake the largest such survey ever done. We'll be looking at assessing marine and avian wildlife off the New York coast, and I would like to first introduce Greg Lampman, who is the Senior Program Manager for Environmental Research at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA. Mr. Lampman manages research projects assessing environmental effects of energy production and their use. He covers areas as diverse as acid and mercury deposition and their associated ecosystem effects, and also alternative energy impacts such as wind and hydrokinetics on wildlife. And Gregory's going to introduce the topic of this webinar.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you all for joining us to discuss how advances in digital imagery can improve our understanding of temporal and spatial distributions of marine wildlife. We think this knowledge will be useful as we advance offshore wind energy because it can reduce development time, help reduce uncertainty and cost for developers, and minimize potential impacts on wildlife. The surveys that are going to begin next week together are the largest of its kind ever undertaken. It's just one of the steps New York State is taking to help ensure the responsible and successful development of offshore wind, which has the potential to provide an estimated 38 gigawatts of energy for New York State. It will also help us achieve the state's clean energy goal of 50% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. As some of you may know, NYSERDA recently announced its intention to participate in BOEM's lease auction of the New York wind energy area. We're the first state entity ever to do so. If successful, we'll be overseeing development of approximately 81,000 acres of lease area, about 12 miles off the coast of Long Island. NYSERDA's intention is to lead the development and timing of the site's progress, ensuring it will be developed at the lowest possible cost for electricity consumers while also protecting the environment. Over the next few years, we'll be undertaking a number of other environmental studies as well as resource assessment and characterization studies to further reduce project costs and impacts. The plan is to package this work with a power purchase mechanism and competitively select a developer for the site. We hope this strategy will minimize project risks and provide developers with certainty in securing funding, maximizing competition, and ultimately lowering project costs for our consumers. The digital aerial survey project we'll be discussing today is going to help with wind energy area site characterization, but it's also going to put the wind energy area we're looking at in the context with the broader region. It's going to be the first step in assessing potential future wind energy areas as well. It's important to note that the survey is being coordinated with visual surveys planned by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, AMAPS, and others, and that all the data collected is going to be publicly available and shared with interested parties. And we're going to get into how to access that data through our portal in the presentation. So as I mentioned previously, our expectation is the project will reduce costs and expedite offshore wind energy development by providing a better understanding of wildlife spatial and temporal distributions. We expect to reduce uncertainty, minimize potential wildlife impacts, and maximize the environmental benefits of renewable offshore wind energy. And with that background, I'll turn it back over to Andrea to introduce our other presenters.
Thank you, Greg. Great introduction. And for those of you on the line from Europe in particular, I think this gives you a glimpse of how the U.S. is trying to move forward with large-scale offshore wind, something that your countries have already done, but we're just kind of getting into this to our process for doing that. So today we have two distinguished scientific presenters. The first is Dr. Greg Forsey, who's a senior scientist and project manager with Normando Associates. He's a certified wildlife biologist with a PhD in zoology from North Dakota State University. He's modeled wetland bird abundance in relation to land use and climate on a landscape scale. At Normando, Dr. Forsey looks at modeling avian and bat collision risks with utilities, understanding temporal changes in bird distributions, and developing spatial tools for modeling avian and bat collisions with wind turbines. Particularly in the offshore environment, he's developed vulnerability indices for birds and has analyzed movements of migratory red knots and piping plovers. Our second speaker, Dr. Stephanie McGovern, who is located in the UK, is the principal ornithologist with APEM Limited. Stephanie is an experienced biometrician who has worked at APEM for 5 years. She's worked on numerous aerial survey projects, primarily for the offshore wind industry, and she's responsible for the statistical analysis of APEM's aerial data. Stephanie has published research on red-throated diver demographics and the effects of long-term environmental change on upland ecosystems. So I'd like to turn it over to Greg Forsey for the beginning of this presentation.
Thanks very much for that overview and background. The Norman Doe APEM team are really excited about this project with NYSERDA because it allows us to bring together our core strengths from both companies on topics such as offshore wind, wildlife, and remote sensing. And this particular team has been working together on digital survey projects since 2013, and those projects have captured data on a variety of taxa, including birds, marine mammals, and turtles during surveys both in the Gulf of Mexico and Hawaii. So this webinar is going to describe not only the project that Greg referenced, but also it'll describe the evolution of our methods and experience over time with other projects, and then briefly explain our general approach to the series of surveys that we'll be doing for NYSERDA, which, by the way, will be the largest offshore high-resolution aerial survey of marine and bird life in U.S. history. So to give you a brief overview of the technology and our experience, I'll give you some examples of the work that both APEM and Norman Doe have done related to both offshore wind and then offshore biological surveys. In Europe, APEM has been using aerial digital survey methods for nearly a decade at offshore sites such as Horns Rev in Denmark. And in 2011, on behalf of BOEM, Norman Doe completed a comparison of 3 different offshore survey methodologies, including boat-based visual surveys, low-altitude aerial visual surveys, high-altitude digital aerial surveys. And we tested these 3 methods using transects surveys off the coast of North Carolina, taking into account the known limitations of each method, such as slower survey speeds for boats, animal attraction and repulsion effects from boats and low-flying aircraft during the low-altitude aerial visual surveys, and then just the general imperfections associated with observer-based data. We tested these 3 methods using transect surveys. These were our survey vessels. For the boat surveys, we had a 40-foot sport fishing boat, and then for both the aerial visual surveys and aerial digital surveys, we had a Cessna 337 Skymaster aircraft. So looking at comparisons among 3 methods, looking at density as a metric, generally our findings from the transect surveys showed that density estimates were similar across the survey types with the exception of turtles, where density recorded from the digital surveys was significantly higher than from the boat-based surveys. Specifically, digital survey estimates were 4 times higher than visual aerial data for turtles, and they were 10 times higher than turtle data from boat survey data. And most of the turtle behavior was recorded as diving during boat and aerial visual surveys, suggesting that repulsion was occurring during the surveys. So that's one of the reasons why we found these differences. We likely found these differences. The other one being low visibility of turtles from boats at sea level and from aircraft, given the short observation time available as observers are flying the transect and traversing the transect. There's not a lot of time to observe the ocean floor for these animals. So for cetaceans, we observed the opposite effect that we saw in sea turtles. There was actually attraction, where we had 96% of the dolphins being observed in the bow or stern waves. In addition to the attraction and repulsion effects, we also experienced issues with data accuracy for both the boat and aerial visual data. For example, for the boat-based data, most observations were at were recorded within a 50 to 500 meter band, and few of the observations were closer or further from the boat, suggesting not only about the repulsion effects, but also the limited ability of observers to detect further than the 100-meter distance. And if you contrast this to the digital data were inherently accurate because the digital data had a defined area of coverage with consistent detectability regardless of the distance from the transect line. And those distances from the transect line could be measured and not approximated like they are with observer-based data. So moving on from density now to identification. What we saw for birds, digital aerial surveys and boat-based surveys achieved higher success than visual aerial surveys. And for turtles and cetaceans, we saw boat-based surveys having the highest success. And this particular figure shows those comparisons. On the x-axis, you have the taxa of interest, birds, cetaceans, and turtles. And then on the y-axis shows the percent of targets that were identified. And then C-plane represents planes with cameras, and then D-plane represents boats or planes with visual surveys, and obviously boats speaks for itself. So in addition, this particular figure shows the identification regardless of image resolution, which we had image resolution from 3.5 centimeters down to 1.5 centimeters. And if we just looked at the 1.5 centimeter resolution imagery, our success rate in identifications was much higher. So our conclusions, general conclusions, the digital aerial surveys offer a significant methodological improvement over visual surveys for turtles, for marine mammals, birds and mammals in low-density situations. Digital and observer-based survey methods may produce similar density estimates, with the caveat that we did not record any marine mammals with long dive times, such as whales. So if those were incorporated, there would likely be differences. We would likely not see the same results. And the density calculations from digital aerial surveys are more accurate and precise, again, because of the precise aerial coverage, the reduced attraction and repulsion effects, and they're not affected by observer detectability biases. So, given the favorable results for aerial digital surveys from our study, these methods are now referenced in BOEM's 2013 guidelines for providing avian survey information for renewable energy development on the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. And it's these same conclusions that were the impetus behind wanting to have access to this particular survey methodology and technology for this study. So we teamed with APEM, who has a vast experience in this area, and I'm going to turn it over to Steph to expand on that. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Greg. So I'll give you a bit of background about APEM's experience. APEM have gained extensive experience in aerial surveys in the last 10 years. We now have 40 staff in the remote sensing team, including ornithology, GIS, and aviation specialists. APEM also owns and operates its own aircraft and camera systems, which allows us complete flexibility to undertake our surveys. APEM is unique as well in that it holds an air operator certificate, which verifies the high health and safety and quality standards that we aim to maintain. And it also means that we're audited regularly, which helps us maintain these standards. APEM has considerable experience in providing high-resolution digital still surveys in both nearshore and offshore habitats. And we've worked for a range of clients, including government agencies and renewable energy developers. Some examples of areas that we've worked in Europe include the North, Irish and Baltic Seas, Pentland Firth and Orkney Waters, and Carmarthen Bay. We have undertaken surveys to aid in the development of offshore wind in all of the funding rounds in the UK, including round 1, 2, the round 2 extension wind farms, and most recently over the last few years in the larger round 3 wind farms within the UK. We have also been involved with similar projects in other parts of Europe. Our data has been used within the planning process to gain consent to build, and we have been involved in collecting data during the construction and post-construction phases to monitor the impact of developments. APEM takes an innovative approach to survey designs, and we're constantly improving our methods as technology advances. And we can tailor our survey method to meet client requirements. Our camera systems and bespoke planning software allows us flexibility in developing our surveys. This flexibility has allowed us to approach problems from a unique angle and has enabled us to develop surveys to tackle situations standard surveys might not necessarily address. An example of this is when we developed and applied a quasi-random survey to estimate the seabird avoidance to operational wind turbines, and this enabled us to calculate a site-specific level of avoidance for key species to aid in the planning process. APEM's collaboration with Normando allows us to utilise our experience and expertise to provide our high-resolution digital still surveys in the United States. The APEM Normando team has successfully worked on a number of projects in the past few years, including baryonyx in the Gulf of Mexico and an onshore breeding census. We will now demonstrate how we will use this experience and flexibility in our designs using NYSERDA as an example. That's back over to you now, Greg.
All right, thanks very much, Steph. So one of the challenges with conducting these offshore surveys is that the area of interest is so large that it's logistically impossible to survey the entire area. So to inform our survey design and the spatial distribution of where our surveys should be, we used existing historical data collected in the OPA, that's the offshore planning area, to identify where species of interest have been observed so that we can target our surveys in those areas. And it's just a good example of using a priori information to inform a starting point for research as opposed to starting from scratch and not having any idea where to begin. So for this project, we looked at data from a variety of sources, including Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, the New England Aquarium, using the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, and MARCO, which is the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal. And while these data have been collected by a variety of different methods, different time frames, they likely have had attraction or repulsion effects from the boats from the surveys, and the data just simply represents an index abundance that has not been corrected for effort. They are still useful as far as being able to identify general patterns of occurrence. So, for example, this map shows the spatial distribution of select bird species in the offshore planning area. And for bird species, they're generally distributed over the whole area. If we remove some of the more common species, such as herring gull and northern gannet, we could start to see patterns from the less common species. For example, black-legged kittiwakes are still found homogeneously across the area. But then you have taxa such as scoters and loons that occur nearer to shore, whereas taxa such as Jaegers and shearwaters occur further offshore. For roseate terns, which is not only an endangered species but also a species of interest for this project, we looked at both empirical and modeled data from Kinlan et al. 2016 as to where we might observe this species, and both the modeled data and the empirical observations suggested that this species would be observed close to shore. For turtles, we saw a different trend. For turtles in the summer, which is shown in the figure on the left, they're more evenly distributed with the exception of the southeast area where they were sparse. Whereas in the fall, which is shown on the figure on the right, their distributions were more patchy and isolated. And although I don't have a slide for it, marine mammals are represented as being fairly evenly distributed throughout the OPA. All right, now I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Steph to talk about the technical approach, what we'll be doing, and the types of equipment that we'll be using. So back over to you, Steph.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'll take you through our general approach to surveys and how we're implementing this with NYSERDA. For this project, APEM will be using a new camera system to undertake these surveys, the Shearwater 3. This camera system allows us to cover a larger footprint area whilst achieving a ground sampling distance of 1.5 centimeters resolution. It also has an integrated GPS and IMU, which provides increased geoposition accuracy. There are a number of key advantages to using 1.5 centimetre resolution as opposed to a more normal 2 centimetre resolution that we've used in the past. The scale or resolution of 1.5 centimetres is the same as seeing a nickel at the sea surface. It provides high-quality data, allowing us more accurate measurements of wildlife, including the head-to-tail and wingspan measurements of birds, and this provides more accurate flight height estimations. It also provides us greater confidence in our ID, as greater detail is visible, including things like the tern bill colour, which will be an important indicator for roseate tern, for example. Better resolution also increases the chance of IDing individual mammals, as unique features may become more apparent. This table just gives an indication of the identification rates that we potentially may have between 2 centimetre and 1.5 centimetre resolution. For some species, there is no difference in the ID rates between the two resolutions, such as for lesser black gulls and great black gulls. This is because the size of the birds allow the identifying features to be clearly visible at 2 centimetre resolution. For other species, particularly the smaller ones, such as common and roseate tern, the identification rate can increase by 15% when using 1.5 centimetre resolution compared to the 2 centimetre resolution. I'm going to show you some examples of our high resolution images. So here you can see some examples from our snags of our digital imagery. In here you can see some gannets, some great black gull, there's a herring gull, a lesser black gull, a widgeon, a great skewer. We have kittiwake, guillemots, black-headed gull, and also a flock of cormorants. And you can see on here, these are at 2 centimetre resolution, so you can see how much detail you can see. Here we've got an example of a harbour porpoise at 2 centimetre resolution. The blue box shows the enlarged snag against the backdrop of the wider image, so you can see how small these mammals can be within the footprint area. And here's a group of seals on a haul out site. We can also detect submerged mammals if they're close to the sea surface. This image shows a minke whale surrounded by some kittiwakes. APEM undertakes all our flight planning in-house. We use a twin-engine aircraft that is capable of flying less than 140 knots, so that at this speed we can ensure we are capturing pictures in the optimum conditions. We always use twin-engine aircraft as well for safety reasons. The survey will be flown at around 1,500 feet, which will allow us to achieve the target 1.5 centimetre resolution at the sea surface. And we have to balance a number of things when determining the flight altitude, and these include safety, as we need to ensure that we abide by flight standards on minimum clearance levels to objects. The weather, as we need to target the most optimum weather to ensure high quality images. The resolution, the target resolution can only be achieved at certain flight altitudes and is dependent on the camera system. And the coverage, and there's always a trade-off between coverage and resolution, as generally the higher the resolution, the lower the coverage that you'll achieve. As APEM use high-resolution digital stills, we are able to utilise two different methods of survey, both the grid-based design or a transect-based design. Typically, the grid-based surveys provide a greater number of samples to analyse, and this helps reduce the deviation within the samples and produces smaller confidence intervals. Small confidence intervals allow us to be more confident in our estimate of the population, which is a good thing. Without small confidence intervals, it is impossible to assess if environmental change has had a significant impact on a population. The grid-based surveys sample the survey area systematically, as images are captured at more regularly spaced intervals and thus are more likely to capture samples from all habitats within the survey area. There is the potential with transect-based surveys that certain habitats may be missed in the gap between the transects if they are spaced further apart. However, transect surveys are good at providing a generalised overview of habitat and species abundance over the large areas. So for this and our further surveys, we will be using both a grid and transect-based design. So there's two different areas that we'll be surveying. The OPA area is very large and covers an area of over 43,000 kilometres squared. And for this reason, we'll be undertaking a transect-based design to capture approximately 7% of the area. We have an indicative transect width of close to 600 metres, and this will capture approximately 3,000 kilometres of imagery. As the WEA wind farm area is smaller, we will be sampling this area with a 4-kilometre buffer using a grid-based design to capture approximately 10% of the area, and this will equate to about 128 kilometres of images. We'll be using these two different designs as the grid-based design ensures we have the most accurate population estimates and capture samples from all potential habitats within the area systematically. And for the OPA, we'll use the transect-based survey to provide background information on the population size and the location of the wildlife. Now, there is a trade-off between coverage and cost, and an intensive grid survey across the whole of the OPA is unfeasible due to it being such a large area, as the costs become prohibitive. And these images here show our indicative survey design with the transect survey on the left and the grid design on the right. It just gives you an idea of the scale of the size of the area. And here we've got the WEA area, and you can see the difference between the transect design and the grid design more closely. The lines on this image represent the transects, with the dots representing the grid design. And you can see we'll be capturing images on a much finer scale within the WEA to ensure we can provide the most detailed and accurate information on wildlife usage within the area. As we've shown, both designs have their benefits and drawbacks. The key features of the transit design is that it's suitable for providing a generalization of habitat and species abundance over large areas. It's also quicker to collect data, which for the OPA survey will be essential to limit the amount of time that we're out surveying. The key features of the grid design is that it has the required power to detect and monitor change in abundance. It provides a greater number of replicates and provides uniform sampling across environmental gradients. Within our survey design, we must consider a number of different aspects to ensure the quality of our images reaches the high standards we aim to maintain. We account for sun angle, which alters according to the time of day or time of year, and we also include direction of the flights in relation to the sun. We target our surveys in sea states 4 or less, but generally aim for 2 or less. And we can also adjust the camera angle to account for expected conditions. Also, during the survey, our camera technicians continuously monitor the images collected for quality, and if the quality of the images drops below our standards, the image acquisition will be stopped until suitable conditions occur. We also routinely collect extra images to ensure we are able to replace a few expected glint-affected images. One of the key aspects of the survey that we need to ensure is that we have high geospatial accuracy so that we can determine where in the survey area is being utilised by wildlife. Our custom flight planning software pre-programs the survey capture points for either a transect or grid. And when out on survey, we have system-specific aircraft-mounted GPS systems to ensure that surveys are flown as accurate as possible. And the software planning system and GPS system enable automatic image acquisition over specified locations, and this is based on actual GPS location and not on a timed basis. As the image data are captured, the GPS data are automatically logged, including the XYZ coordinate and heading of the camera at the point of capture. For our data output, we are aiming to identify the wildlife to the lowest possible taxonomic group. The groups that we'll be identifying include birds, marine mammals, turtles, sharks, rays, fish. And so for each wildlife target seen, we'll use our bespoke in-house software to extract a geo-rectified image snag with associated metadata, which includes height and direction. We'll also be identifying anthropogenic targets we capture, such as boat and net masts, as these can often help with distribution of species. As part of our data output, we will be calculating the flight height of any birds in flight, We are able to do this as we know a number of the variables required to perform the calculation. Using the known altitude of the aircraft and surface resolution, we are able to determine the size of flying birds within the images and calculate the flight height based on the average size of the target bird. This is where good identification rates are key. We can use these flight heights to aid in further modelling, such as collision risk modelling, and can use the data to output box plots such as the one shown. Within our bespoke in-house software, we are also able to determine the bearing of individuals using the head-tail axes, and this provides us with some more valuable information. We can extract this information out into GIS program and utilise this to produce rose diagrams for defined areas, and this can help to identify predominant flight paths or direction. This information can help to identify if any of the birds that we've detected may be linked to areas of wildlife conservation, such as special protection areas here in the UK. The rose diagram on the screen here shows the predominant flight direction as being in the north-south direction. And as there is a strong flight preference shown, this can often be suggestive of passage to or from feeding grounds and breeding colonies, depending on the time of year. Here you can see an example of multiple rose diagrams. And for this species, we compiled them for grid cells across the survey area. And the flight directions show some strong preferences and potentially could attribute them to SBA areas close by and show their passage to and from feeding grounds. So our aim for these surveys is to ensure we capture the best imagery possible to provide the best value data set for the 3-year project. We'll be utilising an adaptive method and will respond to the data as necessary. We'll be looking to see if the year 1 and 2 data confirms with the historical hot and cold spots, or whether these have potentially shifted in the time from that data collection. We will also be assessing whether the survey design adequately meets the requirements of the project, and whether we need to adapt to provide more stratified sampling by area or target species. In addition, we'll also look to provide more detailed, see if we need to provide more detailed data sampling and whether the resolution is providing us with all the information required, particularly for the species of concern. I'll now hand back to Greg to explain the timeframes of the surveys.
Thank you very much, Steph. So in addition to examining the a priori information to determine the spatial distribution of surveys, we also looked at many of the same data sets in order to decide when to survey. So for this project, we decided on 4 seasonal surveys each year, and those surveys would be timed to coincide with peaks in abundance for many of the taxes interest as determined from these data sets. And this is mostly the same slide as I showed you earlier. For the spatial data, we've also added a few, including eBird, which we've used to look at temporal information in bird abundance. So if we look at marine mammal data, we can see peaks of abundance in March and April, particularly for the North Atlantic right whale. There are also some peaks in July and December for sperm whale. And if we look at some of the more common species, such as fin whale and minke whale, it would show a distinct peak in July, whereas the pilot whale peaks during March and April and October. So abundance for turtles tends to peak in June through August, and then again in September through November, although much less of a peak. Looking at eBird data to look at temporal timing, eBird data show peaks year-round depending on the species or taxa of interest, with the exception of July and August, where you see an absence of defined peaks in the data. So to select specific species of interest and capture timings of those species that are considered sensitive to various aspects of offshore wind development, we looked at data from the Boehm sensitivity indices for offshore wind planning. And these indices evaluated the sensitivity of various bird species based on 3 different suites of metrics, that is population sensitivity, collision sensitivity, and displacement sensitivity. So, for example, for species with populations identified as potentially sensitive from wind development include Roseate tern, Corey shearwater, and Audubon shearwater. And then you can also see the other species that were expected to be sensitive from both displacement and collisions as well. And as a side note, when these original indices were done, there was not a lot of good data on metrics that would influence whether species are susceptible. So, for example, from this study, one of the things we hope to get is flight height data, which obviously can influence collision sensitivity. Influence collision sensitivity, and of course these are sparse in the offshore environment. So it's our hope that these surveys can help provide some of that information and fill in some of the gaps. So looking at the temporal variation in abundance for select species during the winter, you can see peaks for Atlantic puffin in March, herring gull in March and November, and razorbill in February, March, and again and in November. For all other species that we looked at, the February and March timeframe seems to be pretty reasonable for them, where we see high numbers of gulls in kittiwake. So this seemed like a good period to survey during the winter. For spring surveys, we wanted to focus on roseate tern, whose numbers have historically shown peaks during April and May. Fortunately, those peaks, or that time period, also coincided with peak abundance for other species as well. For summer surveys, July and August seem to be the best time to search for Cory's and Audubon shearwaters, with them peaking in abundance during this time. And in that same period, we also have peaks in abundance for several other species of petrel and shearwaters as well. So finally, the fall. For fall surveys, October and November have several species of interest, and taxa have their peak abundance during this time, including black-legged kittiwakes, red-throated loons, Jaegers and skuas, and northern gannet. It seems particularly important to be out during the second week of November, where several of the data sets show peak movements of red-throated loons, northern gannets, and the black-legged kittiwakes. And this October-November timeframe also coincides with other peaks of abundance for gulls and loons and some other species as well. So based on the existing data, these were the time frames that were ideal for conducting the aerial digital surveys in the OPA, was capturing as many animals as possible. With the help of BOEM, we're also coordinating with other surveys going on in the area at the same time, most of which are targeting marine mammals. And we're doing this coordination so that for not only health and safety reasons, but also because of the detectability issues that I talked about earlier in the presentation with the attraction and repulsion effects that can happen when there are boats and low-flying aircraft in the area. So in closing, one of our goals and one of NYSERDA's goals is to make the results and data easily accessible to the public. So as a consequence, all project data will be available on these data portals at the end of each annual cycle. And in addition, we've also built an internal project website which also houses the data. And you can access the website at remote.normandeau.com/NYSERDA. There's no data there right now because the surveys haven't begun yet, but there is some background information on the project, and it's a good place to find out more about the study as more information comes in. And if you have any suggestions for the project, you can contact Gregory Lampman at NYSERDA at this email address. And with that, draw a conclusion and turn it back over to the moderators for directing questions. And they also have some more slides to discuss as well. Thank you.
Very much, Greg and Stephanie. That was really great. Just to wrap up this webinar, this is WREN's 8th webinar, and each of these perspectives, as you've heard today, comes from multiple nations on the research, monitoring, methodologies, and results of wind energy and wildlife interactions. If you're not on our webinar mailing list, there is the email to get. Just send an email to that. So I'm going to leave that out while we do Q&A, just so you can actually get that email down. So I think that was a really great presentation. introduction to the work that is going to go on off the New York coast based on what has been done before. So I've got a couple of questions here, but we've got time for others. So I'd like to suggest that the audience direct some questions towards write them in there. So I got two questions here to start things off, though. The first is for Stephanie. You are obviously taking some really high-resolution pictures, which really generates a significant amount of data. How do you handle and process the data? And do you use image recognition to focus on those frames for an analyst to look at?
Yeah, we do generate a lot of data, and this project in particular will be generating more than we've had in a survey before. We have very stringent data processes that we follow for all our projects, including backing up data multiple times and holding it in different areas and things so that we can ensure we never ever lose any data. In terms of processing it, it's using high capacity machines to ensure we can process it quickly enough. For the object recognition, we have bespoke in-house software that we use, and this does identify targets within the images for our image analysts to identify.
Apologies, I was muted and talking to who knows what. Let me try a question again. We have a question asking about the availability and format of the data on the Normandy site. What will the format be? When will the data be posted and made available? Will it be on an annual basis?
Yeah, so the data should be available to interact with on the website through the mapping application, and also I believe it's going to also be made available to download as a CSV file as well. And the question about time frame, yes, it is going to be made available at the end of each annual cycle.
Thank you. So another question, and this one could be for, I think, either of you or even Greg Lampman. The New York wind energy area is in the center of two traffic separation schemes for commercial shipping, significant commercial shipping in the area. How are you going to interpret your line of wildlife off New York, given that it is affected by the intermittent passage of ships? And building on that, how would you design a post-construction monitoring program that measures changes against this baseline, seeing as you've got this, shipping sort of additional stressor? So I don't know who wants to address that one.
Well, this is Greg Forsey. We're coordinating with like I said, we're coordinating with BOEM to the extent possible that we can address impacts from the ships and planes doing any kind of wildlife surveys out there. I don't know that we've addressed the issue with the other ships that you're referring to in your question. And then as far as the second part of your question about the post-construction monitoring study, I'm not sure I would know how to answer that because there's so many possible variables that would come into play with doing a post-construction monitoring study out there, namely what are the goals of the study. So that would certainly dictate how the methodology would be different depending on what the goals were.
Great, thank you. We have another question asking if you would comment, possibly for Stephanie, possibly for Greg, can you comment on how you decided to use digital imagery versus video imagery, and because video has been used pretty extensively in some of these surveys?
This is Greg Lampman. So the way we selected digital imagery over video imagery, we basically had an RFP to select projects, It wasn't a selection of a particular technology so much as an overall proposal, what extent the area was going to be covered, what density of coverage we were going to get, and what the costs were. So a lot of factors went into the decision making. It wasn't a selection necessarily of digital versus video imagery.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Are you using physically tagged species to quality control visual observation? And are you sharing the attraction effect findings with state endangered species programs which currently rely primarily on boat observation? Not sure who wants to take that one. So the question is, are you using tagged species as ground truthing? And are you informing local agencies, state agencies, that what kind of effects you're getting from boat surveys?
No, we don't have any plans to use any tagged data.
Okay.
And then as far as the other part of the question, are we working with state agencies to talk about the differences in the? Well, can you clarify the last part of the question again?
I think it was that clearly boat-based surveys are having some effect on the animals as you try to create a baseline survey, and yet this is the most commonly used method of observation by state agencies. And wondered if you were sharing some of the results that I think Greg showed of that there are obviously effects of this kind of observation on the animals.
Well, as far as the reports that the studies that I mentioned that showed the differences in effects, those are all publicly available on BOEM's website. So those are anybody can go and download those reports and look at the data. As far as the results from this particular study, we're making all the data available on all the data portals and our own internal website. So those are certainly available to look at. I don't know that we had planned on making any specific outreach to agencies directly, but if there's anybody that would be interested in that, they can contact us.
Great, thank you. And that comes right to the next question is, could you put back the slide or possibly just mention what other portals the data will be available on besides the Norman Dove site?
Yep, there it is.
Perfect, thank you. Maybe just leave that up for a sec.
Just to add that a little bit, our goal of providing data to these sites was our intention is not to reproduce what other folks are doing. So these entities are using this data in a variety of ways. We want to feed our information into those existing data sets to expand their value, not recreate a new data set for people to have to confer with and coordinate with.
Great, thank you. I think this is a follow-on to the question about sort of alerting state agencies about some of these attraction and repulsion avoidance issues that the state agencies tend to look at NOAA's stranding and entanglement network for turtles and marine mammals. And I think your statement probably still holds that these are available and that they will be looked at by these other agencies. We have another question that I think may be a little out of your field, but Greg Lampman, you might want to perhaps address, and that is, how was the WEA location chosen off New York?
So there's a joint task force, the New York State BOEM Task Force, that worked together to determine where wind turbines may be appropriate. So we're in that process now. This was one of the first sites identified in New York. So there's a vetting process that goes through that committee to decide. At this stage, following the auction, there'll be more vetting of that area to determine if it is appropriate for wind energy development. But it's a joint BOEM New York State Task Force.
Great. Okay, let me just take a quick look. I think the one other question that's come in is asking, I guess, all of us at large, will you provide any periodic webinars similar to this one to present interim findings? I don't know, Greg Lampman, would you like to address that?
It's a possibility. So we are doing updates. We have a project advisory committee comprised of state and federal regulators who help put this together. We're going to be keeping them up to date on the progress along the way, and in all likelihood, we'll be doing some public presentations as well.
Wonderful. And here at WREN, we are always looking for great webinars that produce results. So that's always a possibility. Okay, I think that's about the questions we have that aren't redundant at this point. So if we could go to those last couple of slides, Greg Forsey, please. I think we'll start to wrap up here. As I mentioned, if you are not on our webinar list, please get your name on that, and you will receive updates from us. And please watch your email for the next planned WREN webinar, which is not yet posted. Following this presentation, we will receive the slide deck, which will be posted on TSIS at that location listed there. And we will also have an audio recording of the presentation itself as well as the questions and answers. So next slide, please. I would like to thank all of you for coming on the line today and sticking with us. And please feel free to go to TSIS, the WREN site afterwards, to download the webinars and examine the material again. If you have any ideas for future webinars, we have a number lined up, but we're always looking for webinar topics that are of real interest to the wind community. Please contact one of our WREN members, team members that are listed here. With that, I think we are going to wrap up here today. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.